A little girl was found in a sack by the river, her tiny form barely visible through the rough fabric. The mountain man, known for his stoic demeanor and rugged independence, broke down in tears at the sight. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The first thaw of spring always brought strange things down the river. Broken branches, lost trinkets from upstream villages, and occasionally, supplies that had been swept away during winter storms. But nothing could have prepared John Smith for what he found tangled among the reeds that cold morning. The hermit had been following his usual routine, checking the riverbank for anything useful that might supplement his meager stores. His weathered boots sank into the mud as he made his way along the water's edge, the mountain air still carrying winter's bite despite the promise of warmer days ahead. At first, he thought it was just another sack of grain, perhaps lost from a trader's cart upriver. Such findings weren't uncommon, though the contents were usually spoiled beyond salvation. Still, John approached with practiced caution, his calloused hands reaching for the knife at his belt. The burlap was sodden and heavy as he dragged it from the reeds. Something about its weight felt wrong, too dense, too precisely shaped. The hermit's brow furrowed as he sliced through the rough material, expecting to find waterlogged flour or perhaps a farmer's seed stock. Instead, John's strong hands trembled as he cut open the sack and met the wide, terrified eyes of a little girl. She was barely more than a shadow, shivering and silent, but undeniably alive. Her small body curled into itself, seeking warmth that wasn't there. Dark hair clung to her pale face, and those eyes, those haunting eyes, stared up at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. For a moment, John couldn't move. The solitude he had cultivated for years, the careful distance he maintained from the village below, all of it shattered in an instant. This child, this fragile life, represented everything he had fled from: connection, responsibility, the messy entanglements of human need. For the first time in years, tears streamed down John's weathered face. They came without warning, cutting paths through the grime on his cheeks. He quickly shrugged off his worn jacket and wrapped it around the shivering child, cradling her against his chest. "You're safe now," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince the girl or himself. The echo of his solitude was broken by the miracle and burden fate had delivered to his doorstep. As John turned toward his cabin, the child still silent in his arms, he knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Word spread through the mountain village like wildfire. By midday, every household buzzed with talk of the child found in the sack. Women paused their weaving to exchange theories, while men lowered their voices as they passed John Smith's distant cabin. The discovery had shattered the predictable rhythm of village life. "A curse from upstream," muttered Elder Thomas Davis, his weathered face creasing with concern as he addressed the gathering crowd. "The river never gives without taking something in return." Mary Johnson disagreed. The healer stood with arms crossed, her knowledge of life and death lending weight to her words. "The child is a blessing. Perhaps the mountain itself has answered our prayers for new life." As debate raged in the village square, Robert Brown's commanding voice rose above the others. The blacksmith pounded his fist against the wooden post. "The girl must be brought down to the village immediately. We'll care for her together, as we've always done." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The village had always faced hardships collectively, sharing both burdens and blessings. A lone child needed the community's protection, not the awkward care of a hermit who barely spoke to another soul. 3 villagers volunteered to retrieve the girl, trudging up the winding path to John's cabin. They found him sitting outside, his large frame hunched protectively over a small bundle wrapped in his only clean blanket. "We've come for the child," announced the eldest of the group. "The village will raise her properly. You've done your part, Smith." John looked up, his eyes reflecting something the villagers hadn't seen in years: emotion. His hands, calloused from years of solitary work, tightened around the bundle. "She stays with me," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Be reasonable," the villager pressed. "What does a man like you know about raising a child? She needs women's care, proper food." John rose to his full height, towering over his visitors. The girl peeked out from the woolen blanket, her eyes wide with fear at the strangers. "I found her," he stated simply. "She's my responsibility now." The visitors exchanged glances, unprepared for this resistance. They'd expected the hermit to be relieved at having the burden lifted from his shoulders. "The village won't like this," one warned. "There will be talk." John turned away, carrying the girl into his cabin and closing the door firmly behind him. Inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. What did he know about caring for a child? Nothing. Yet something fierce and protective had awakened within him, a feeling so foreign he barely recognized it as his own. That night, as the girl slept beside his hearth, John stared into the flames, wondering what madness had possessed him to challenge the entire village for the sake of a child he'd known less than a day. Cold seeped through the cracks of John Smith's cabin like an unwelcome guest, finding every gap in the weathered logs he'd stacked years ago. The little girl shivered beneath 3 woolen blankets, her tiny frame barely creating a mound on his makeshift bed. John paced nervously, his calloused hands useless against this new threat. He could track deer for miles, build shelter in a blizzard, but the sight of the child's blue-tinged lips sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the mountain chill. "Breathe, just breathe," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The fire roared in the hearth, consuming precious wood faster than he could gather it, yet the cabin remained mercilessly cold. When her breathing grew shallow, panic clawed at his chest. The hermit had survived isolation by avoiding dependence on others, but tonight, pride would have to bow to necessity. Before dawn broke, John bundled the girl in every blanket he owned and cradled her against his chest. The winding trail to the village seemed longer than ever, each step treacherous on frost-slick stones. His breath clouded before him as he whispered awkward reassurances to the silent bundle in his arms. The village was just stirring when he pounded on Mary Johnson's door. The healer's initial surprise at seeing the mountain man on her doorstep quickly transformed to concern when she glimpsed the child's pallid face. "Bring her in," Mary commanded, her stern voice brooking no argument. "Place her by the fire." John watched helplessly as the healer worked, her experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency. She crushed dried leaves, steeped roots, and muttered ancient words that seemed to dance with the steam rising from her pots. "You can't keep her warm with just wood and blankets," Mary explained, demonstrating how to brew a tea of pine needles and mountain ginger. "Children this small need warmth from within." The hermit's brow furrowed as he struggled to memorize each step. Mary showed him how to wrap the girl in layers of dried herbs that released gentle heat when pressed against skin. She taught him to recognize the signs of fever versus chill and how each required different remedies. "I don't need," John began, his pride flaring. "Yes, you do," Mary interrupted, her weathered face softening slightly. "Everyone needs help sometimes, even mountain men." By midday, color had returned to the child's cheeks. John reluctantly accepted a pouch of dried herbs, a jar of honey, and knowledge that felt foreign in his self-reliant hands. As he carried the sleeping girl back up the mountain path, he felt the weight of a debt he couldn't repay and a connection to the village he tried so hard to sever. The girl's recovery was gradual but steady. Each day, Anna's pale cheeks gained more color as she sipped the herbal teas Mary Johnson had taught John to prepare. The cabin, once a monument to solitude, now echoed with sounds John had forgotten. Breathing not his own, the rustle of movement, the occasional whisper. It was on the 7th night that John Smith first heard it. He'd been dozing by the hearth when a melody, soft as snowfall, yet clear as mountain water, drifted through the cabin. Anna sat upright in her makeshift bed, eyes half closed, singing words in a language he couldn't place. The tune carried something ancient in its notes, something that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked the next morning, his voice gruff with disuse. The child merely shrugged, tracing patterns in her porridge with a wooden spoon. John mentioned the lullaby to Mary during her next visit, watching as the healer's face grew troubled. "I've never heard its like," Mary confessed, her weathered hands pausing in their work. "Perhaps Elder Thomas might know. The old legends speak of mountain songs that come not from teaching, but from the stones themselves." John scoffed at such notions, yet couldn't explain how a child barely strong enough to walk could know melodies unknown to those who'd lived their entire lives in these mountains. As winter deepened, he took Anna outside, teaching her to navigate the snow-covered landscape. The hermit found himself studying her with growing fascination. She moved through his world with an ease that challenged everything he thought he knew about children, about survival, about himself. Each night, he added another log to the fire, keeping the cabin warmer than he'd ever bothered to maintain it when alone. One evening, as they shared a meal of rabbit stew, Anna reached across the rough-hewn table and placed her small hand atop his calloused one. "Thank you," she whispered, the first unprompted words she'd spoken since her arrival. Something shifted in John's chest, a wall crumbling, a door opening. He nodded gruffly, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. The iron fortress he'd built around his heart, reinforced by years of chosen isolation, now faced its greatest threat: the simple gratitude of a child who looked at him not with fear or judgment, but with trust. The summer sun bathed the valley in golden light, melting away the last memories of frost. The mountain village came alive with preparations for the annual festival, a tradition that stretched back generations. Colorful banners fluttered between wooden homes, and the scent of fresh bread wafted through the air. John Smith stood at the edge of his property, watching the distant activity, with a mixture of longing and apprehension. "Do we have to go?" he asked the small figure beside him, already knowing her answer. The girl nodded eagerly, her eyes bright with excitement. In the months since he'd pulled her from the river, she had transformed from a frightened shadow into a curious, resilient child. John sighed, his weathered hands adjusting the simple dress he'd traded a week's worth of firewood to obtain. As they descended the winding path toward the village square, John felt increasingly vulnerable. He had spent years cultivating his isolation, becoming the mountain hermit villagers spoke of in hushed tones. Now, with a child's hand clutched firmly in his, that carefully constructed barrier was crumbling. The festivities were already underway when they arrived. Musicians played traditional tunes while villagers danced in circles around a central pole adorned with ribbons. Conversations halted as John and the girl passed, replaced by whispers that followed them like persistent shadows. "The hermit and his river child," someone murmured. "Bad omen," another voice countered. "Poor little thing," came a sympathetic tone. Mary Johnson, her gray hair braided neatly for the occasion, approached them with purposeful strides. The healer's stern expression softened as she knelt before the girl. "It's time you had a proper name, child," Mary announced, loud enough for nearby villagers to hear. "Anna. It means grace in the old tongue, a new beginning." The girl, Anna, smiled shyly, testing the name with a whispered repetition. Robert Brown watched from his position by the central bonfire, his blacksmith's arms crossed tightly across his chest. His suspicious gaze never left John, even as Elder Thomas Davis blessed the gathering with traditional words of protection. As night fell, massive bonfires illuminated the mountainside. Villagers danced and sang, their inhibitions melting away with each cup of sweet fermented berry drink. To John's surprise, several approached him, offering food, asking about Anna, or simply acknowledging his presence with a nod. Anna fell asleep against his chest, as the celebration continued around them. Looking down at her peaceful face, then up at the community he'd abandoned years ago, John realized something profound had changed. The invisible barrier he'd built between himself and others had begun to dissolve. For the first time in years, people saw him, truly saw him, and the sensation was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The earth shook with a deafening roar as tons of rock and debris cascaded down the mountain pass. John Smith stood at the edge of the village, Anna clutched tightly against his chest, as they watched their only connection to the outside world disappear beneath nature's fury. No warning, no mercy, just the mountain asserting its ancient dominance. Within days, the consequences became painfully clear. The trading route that had supplied the village with necessities was gone, buried under boulders larger than houses. Food stores began to dwindle, medicines grew scarce, and the whispers started, quiet at first, then growing louder with each passing day. "The girl brought this upon us," an old woman muttered in the village square, her eyes darting toward Anna. "Strange things follow strange arrivals." Robert Brown called an emergency gathering, his broad blacksmith shoulders squared with determination as he addressed the anxious villagers. "We must ration what we have and work together," he announced, hammering his fist against a wooden post. "This pass can be cleared if we combine our strength." But beneath his rallying cry ran a current of blame. The blacksmith's gaze repeatedly drifted to where John stood with Anna, his expression hardening each time. "Some say the mountain spirits are displeased," Robert continued, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "Perhaps by changes to our way of life." John felt the weight of those words, understood their true target. He pulled Anna closer as murmurs rippled through the gathering. "The timing cannot be ignored," someone called out. "The child arrives, the mountain falls." Something fierce and protective ignited in John's chest. He stepped forward, his voice rusty from disuse but strong with conviction. "The mountain has fallen before, long before any of us were born, long before Anna came to us." Robert's eyes narrowed. "You've been gone too long, hermit. You've forgotten our ways, our beliefs." Old wounds reopened between them, unspoken grievances from years past when John had turned his back on community and tradition. The tension crackled like static before a storm. "I remember enough," John replied, feeling Anna trembling against him. "I remember how quickly we look for someone to blame when we're afraid." Mary Johnson pushed through the crowd, her healer's bag clutched tightly. "This child is not our curse," she declared firmly, "but how we treat her might become one." The villagers shifted uncomfortably, caught between superstition and shame. John met Robert's challenging stare across the square, neither man willing to yield. The blacksmith might command respect, but John's stubborn determination had been forged through years of solitude. As the gathering dispersed, John realized that protecting Anna now meant more than keeping her fed and warm. It meant defending her against the fear that threatened to make her a scapegoat for the village's misfortunes. The weeks after the rockslide brought an unexpected peace to John Smith's cabin. As summer deepened, Anna grew stronger each day, her once frail body now nimble as she followed him through the forest. John found himself sharing knowledge he'd kept locked away since his own childhood, skills passed down from father to son for generations. "Keep your steps light," he instructed, demonstrating how to approach a snare without disturbing the surrounding brush. Anna watched with intense concentration, her small hands mimicking his movements with surprising precision. The hermit discovered a patience he never knew he possessed. When Anna's first attempt at setting a trap failed, her disappointment was palpable. But John simply knelt beside her and guided her fingers through the motions again. "My father made me practice for weeks before I caught anything," he admitted, surprising himself with the rare personal revelation. They spent long afternoons tracking deer through the underbrush, John teaching her to read the subtle signs most eyes would miss: a bent twig, disturbed soil, the particular pattern of hoofprints that told stories about the animal's size and direction. Anna absorbed everything eagerly, her quick mind connecting details that sometimes even surprised her teacher. "These are the sweetest," John explained one morning, pushing aside thorny brambles to reveal plump berries hidden underneath. "Animals don't often brave the thorns, so these are our secret." The girl's delighted smile as juice stained her fingers purple became a treasure he hadn't sought, but couldn't help valuing. Yet for all his attempts to maintain their isolation, Anna's curiosity about the village grew. She peppered him with questions about the smoke rising from distant chimneys and the sounds of celebration that occasionally drifted up the mountainside. "Do they make cloth like Mary showed me?" she asked one evening, fingers tracing the pattern of her blanket. "Can I see how they do it?" The healer had visited twice since the rock slide, bringing herbs and staying to teach Anna simple weaving techniques. These visits had awakened something in the child, a hunger for connection beyond their quiet cabin. John resisted at first, making excuses about work and weather. But Anna's persistent requests wore down his defenses, her laughter and wonder chipping away at walls built over years of solitude. When the village announced their midsummer weaving ritual, Anna's pleading eyes finally broke his resolve. Reluctantly, John agreed to take her, his stomach nodding with anxiety as they descended the familiar path toward the community he'd abandoned. Her hand in his, warm and trusting, became both anchor and guide, pulling him back toward a world he'd convinced himself he no longer needed, weaving him slowly back into the fabric of human connection he'd torn himself from long ago. Autumn descended with a bitter edge, painting the mountainside in fiery hues while delivering a meager harvest that left the village on edge. John Smith watched with growing concern as villagers gathered their modest yields, their faces etched with worry lines deeper than usual. The communal storage held barely half what they needed for winter, and whispers of hardship spread faster than the evening fog. At the weekly gathering, Elder Thomas Davis stood with trembling hands, his weathered face grave as he addressed the anxious crowd. "The mountain spirits are displeased," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the hushed square. "Our rituals were broken when the river child came." Several villagers nodded in solemn agreement, casting sidelong glances toward John's isolated cabin on the hillside. The hermit noticed how people averted their eyes when he and Anna ventured into the village for supplies. Even Mary Johnson, typically steadfast in her support, seemed troubled as she handed over bundles of dried herbs. "The elders have been gathering nightly," she whispered, her stern features softening momentarily. "Be careful, John." Back at the cabin, Anna had grown restless with the changing season. The little girl explored every corner of their modest home, her curiosity insatiable despite the growing chill. One afternoon, while John chopped firewood outside, she dragged the old sack from beneath his bed, the very one she'd arrived in months before. "What's this?" she asked, her small fingers tracing something inside the rough fabric. John set down his axe and knelt beside her, surprised as she pulled out a finely woven cloth hidden in the sack's lining. The intricate pattern shimmered with dyes he'd never seen before, rich blues and purples that no mountain plant could produce. "Where did this come from?" he murmured, examining the delicate weaving. The next day, he wrapped the cloth carefully and took it to Mary, hoping her knowledge might shed light on its origins. The healer turned it over in her hands, brow furrowed. "This isn't from our valley," she confirmed, running her fingers along the unfamiliar pattern. "These dyes come from coastal regions, perhaps even beyond the trading routes." Word of the discovery spread quickly. Robert Brown examined the cloth at the village square, his face darkening as he declared it foreign work with suspicious origins. By nightfall, new rumors circulated that Anna was no ordinary abandoned child, but perhaps part of something larger, something that threatened their isolated existence. That night, as wind rattled the cabin windows, John watched Anna sleeping peacefully. The mysterious cloth raised unsettling questions. Was her appearance truly random? Or was she somehow connected to the village's fate? For the first time, he wondered if protecting her meant uncovering truths he might not be prepared to face. The first snow of the season fell silently, coating the mountain village in white. John Smith stood at his cabin door, watching Anna chase snowflakes with outstretched hands. Her laughter echoed against the silent woods, a sound that still surprised him after months of caring for the once silent child. Inside, as Anna napped beneath woolen blankets, John examined the sack that had delivered her to him. He'd kept it stored away, unable to discard the only link to her past. Running his fingers along the rough fabric, he noticed something he'd overlooked. A small symbol carefully carved into one corner. 3 intersecting lines forming a distinctive mark. His blood ran cold. He recognized that symbol. It was the same mark Robert Brown stamped into his metalwork, a signature the blacksmith had used for years. "It can't be," John whispered, his mind racing. Was the village blacksmith somehow connected to Anna's abandonment? The thought was too terrible to contemplate, yet the evidence lay literally in his hands. The next morning, John bundled Anna warmly and left her in Mary Johnson's care. "Just for a few hours," he explained, avoiding the healer's questioning gaze. Mary simply nodded, her weathered hands already guiding Anna toward a collection of dried herbs. The blacksmith's forge glowed orange against the winter landscape. Robert looked up from his anvil, his expression hardening at the sight of the hermit. "What brings you down from your mountain?" he asked, hammer pausing mid-strike. John pulled out the sack, unfolding it carefully. "This symbol, it's yours." Robert's face drained of color before flushing with anger. "What are you accusing me of?" "I'm not accusing, I'm asking," John said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "This sack held Anna when I found her in the river. Your mark is on it." "Many use my sacks for grain," the blacksmith snapped, throwing down his tools. "I trade them to travelers. They could end up anywhere." Their voices rose, drawing curious villagers. Soon a small crowd gathered, whispers spreading like wildfire. Elder Thomas arrived, his presence commanding immediate attention. "What happens here disturbs the peace," the elder said gravely. As John explained, faces in the crowd shifted from curiosity to suspicion. Neighbors, who had shared bread during harvest, now eyed each other warily. Who among them might know something about the abandoned child? As he trudged back up the mountain path to collect Anna, he felt the village's unity crumbling behind him. The community that had weathered countless hardships together now fractured along fault lines of fear, tradition, and what John increasingly suspected was collective guilt. Mary Johnson's cough echoed through her small healer's hut as she stirred herbs into a steaming pot. Her weathered hands trembled slightly, not just from illness, but from the weight of what she was about to share. John Smith sat across from her, his eyes fixed on the flickering shadows cast by the hearth fire. "There's something you should know about Anna," Mary said, in voice barely above a whisper. "9 winters ago, a woman came to me in the dead of night. She was terrified, clutching her newborn to her chest." The healer paused, pressing a cloth to her mouth as another cough rattled her frail frame. John leaned forward, his calloused hands gripping his knees. "Who was she?" "A stranger to our village, but not to these mountains," Mary continued. "She had secrets in her eyes, dangerous ones. I tended to her fever, gave her shelter." The old woman's gaze drifted to the window, where snowflakes danced in the evening air. When she recovered, she vanished into the highlands with her child. "And you think that child was Anna?" John's heart quickened. Mary nodded slowly. "The timing fits. The woman had unusual markings on her clothing, similar to the pattern on that sack you found. Guilt shadowed her tired eyes. I should have done more, followed her perhaps, but I respected her fear. Now I wonder if that silence cost her life." John ran his fingers through his beard, connecting fragments of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. Did she say anything about who was after her? Nothing specific, but she mentioned powerful people beyond the pass. Mary reached for a small wooden box on her shelf, opening it to reveal a scrap of fabric. She left this behind. I've kept it all these years, not knowing why. The cloth fragment matched the unusual weave of Anna's sack perfectly. As John walked home through the snow-laden forest, his mind churned with revelations. Anna's arrival wasn't random chance or simple abandonment. It was part of a story that had been unfolding for years, perhaps decades. The little girl sleeping in his cabin represented threads of fate that connected the village to secrets beyond their isolated valley. Back at the cabin, John watched Anna sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling beneath the woolen blankets. He realized now that in cutting open that sack by the riverbank, he hadn't just saved a child, he had unleashed truths that had been deliberately buried. The mountain man stoked the fire, preparing for a long night of contemplation. Anna wasn't just a lost child, she was a living question mark, a summons for forgotten stories and hidden histories to finally surface. Through tears, she described towering stone spires and deep caverns she'd never seen, places hidden in the mountain's heart that no child could possibly know. There were voices in the rock, she whispered, clutching John's weathered hand. They sang songs about coming home. The hermit dismissed it as childish imagination, but when the dreams persisted night after night, growing more detailed and disturbing, he reluctantly sought counsel from Elder Thomas Davis. The white-haired guardian of mountain legends had always struck John as a superstitious fool, but desperation drove him down the snowy path to the elder's dwelling. Thomas listened intently as Anna recounted her visions, his gnarled fingers trembling as he traced ancient symbols in the hearth ash. The old man's eyes widened with each description: hidden springs, forgotten caves, burial grounds known only to those who kept the oldest stories. "This child sees with the mountain's eyes," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "The spirits have marked her." John scoffed, but couldn't ignore the chill that ran down his spine when Anna correctly described the sacred grove where village ancestors had once performed rituals. A place she had never visited, a tradition long abandoned. The elder insisted on bringing Anna's gift before the entire community. At the next gathering in the village square, with snow falling gently around them, Thomas raised his arms for silence. The villagers huddled close, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "The mountain has sent us a messenger," he proclaimed, placing a withered hand on Anna's shoulder. "This child is touched by the ancient spirits that guard our valley. Her dreams are not dreams, but visions." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some villagers crossed themselves while others whispered prayers. Robert Brown stood with arms folded, skepticism etched across his face. But even he couldn't deny the unnatural knowledge the girl possessed. Mary Johnson watched from the edge of the gathering, her knowing eyes meeting John's across the crowd. The healer had suspected something unusual about Anna from the beginning, but this public declaration would change everything. John felt the ground shift beneath him. He'd always prided himself on practical thinking, on rejecting the superstitions that governed village life. Yet standing there, watching Anna's small face illuminated by torchlight, he couldn't dismiss the growing certainty that the child he'd pulled from the river was somehow connected to forces beyond his understanding. His world tilted between skepticism and wonder, between protecting Anna from those who would exploit her, and accepting that her destiny might be greater than anything he could control. The winter came with a vengeance. Howling winds and thick snow, transforming John Smith's modest cabin into the last bastion against nature's fury. Icicles hung like daggers from the eaves, and frost patterns etched themselves across the single window where Anna would press her small nose, watching the world turn white. "Will the snow ever stop?" she asked one evening, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful cry. John looked up from the meager stew he stirred over the hearth. "It always does eventually," he answered, though uncertainty gnawed at him. Their food stores were dwindling faster than anticipated. Word reached them through Elder Thomas Davis that illness had swept through the village below. A fever that started with the youngest children had spread to the elders, leaving few hands to tend the sick or gather necessities. Mary Johnson worked tirelessly, her remedies stretched thin among too many patients. When their own supplies ran dangerously low, John knew he had no choice. "I need to go down to the village," he told Anna, wrapping himself in layers of worn clothing. "Stay by the fire. I'll return before nightfall." The journey down was treacherous, the path obscured by snowdrifts taller than a man. John pushed forward, his breath forming clouds that were immediately torn away by the wind. The village, when he finally reached it, was eerily quiet, except for coughing that echoed from several homes. Mary's hut was crowded with the sick. The healer herself looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes as she crushed dried herbs with practiced movements. "John," she acknowledged without looking up, "I wondered when you'd come." He helped her prepare remedies for hours, grinding roots and mixing tinctures until his hands were stained and raw. In return, she gave him a small pouch of medicine for Anna and what little food she could spare. "The blacksmith has been asking about you," Mary mentioned quietly. "Robert thinks you're hoarding supplies up there." John's jaw tightened. "We're surviving, nothing more." 3 more times that week, he braved the mountain paths, once for firewood from the high ridges, where dead pines stood like sentinels in the snow, and twice more to help Mary deliver medicine to outlying homes. Each journey left him more exhausted than the last, his body aching with cold and exertion. Yet returning to the cabin, seeing Anna's face light up at his approach made every risk worthwhile. She had fashioned small figures from pine cones and twigs while he was gone, creating stories that she eagerly shared. "This one's you," she said, holding up a particularly rugged-looking creation. "See? Strong enough to fight the winter." Her unwavering faith in him became John's anchor through the darkest days. When food grew scarce, they made games of stretching their meals. When the cold penetrated even the thickest blankets, they huddled together by the fire, and Anna's laughter somehow made the cabin warmer than any flame could. Robert Brown slammed his fist against the wooden table, silencing the gathered villagers. The blacksmith's face flushed red with anger as he pointed an accusatory finger at John Smith. "That child brings nothing but misfortune," Robert shouted, his voice echoing through the village hall. "Since she arrived, our supplies have dwindled, sickness has spread, and the mountain pass remains blocked. How much more must we endure before you see reason?" John stood his ground, arms crossed defensively across his chest. The hermit had avoided confrontation for years, preferring the solitude of his cabin to the politics of village life. But now, with Anna's safety at stake, he found himself at the center of a brewing storm. "Anna is just a child," John replied, his voice low but firm. "She's not responsible for our hardships." Several villagers nodded in agreement, but others exchanged worried glances. The blacksmith seized upon their uncertainty. "You abandoned us years ago," Robert continued, twisting the knife of old wounds. "You turned your back on this community when we needed every hand. Now you return with this stranger, and expect us to welcome trouble with open arms?" The accusation hung heavy in the air. John felt the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment. The memory of his departure after his brother's death still haunted these halls. "Take sides if you must," the blacksmith declared to the crowd, "but remember who has always been here, working the forge, strengthening our defenses, and who chose solitude over solidarity." The village split before John's eyes. Families who had known him since childhood now regarded him with suspicion, while others defended his right to care for Anna. Unity crumbled like dry earth beneath their feet. Later that evening, Anna clung to John's hand as they walked the path to Mary Johnson's home. The child's eyes darted nervously at every shadow, her small fingers tightening around his whenever villagers passed by. "They don't like me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening wind. The healer welcomed them with herbal tea and a sympathetic smile. Mary had become Anna's strongest advocate besides John, teaching her simple remedies and village songs by the fire. "People fear what they don't understand," Mary explained gently, wrapping a woolen blanket around Anna's shoulders. "The mountain teaches patience. They will learn." As Anna dozed by the hearth, John stared into the flames, the line between protector and exile blurring in the flickering light. "Perhaps I was wrong to bring her here," he confessed. "Perhaps I was wrong to come back at all." Mary's weathered hand covered his. "The river brought her to you for a reason, John, and perhaps it's bringing you back to us as well." The wind howled like a wounded beast as darkness fell over the mountain village. Inside John Smith's cabin, the fire struggled against the bitter cold, but it was nothing compared to the heat radiating from Anna's small body. Her cheeks burned crimson, her breathing shallow and labored. John pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, his calloused hands trembling with a fear he hadn't known since the day he'd found her. "Stay with me, little one," he whispered, his voice breaking. The hermit had faced blizzards, hunger, and isolation, but this helplessness cut deeper than any winter chill. Throughout the endless night, John battled memories of his mother's death, how he'd sat powerless beside her bed, watching fever claim her. He'd fled to the mountains afterward, convinced that attachment only led to pain. Now, as Anna's fever raged, those old wounds reopened. "I can't lose you too," he murmured, replacing the cloth for the 100th time. The cabin walls seemed to close in, trapping him with his failures, past and present. He tried every remedy he knew, brewing pine needle tea, wrapping her in cool cloths, but nothing broke the fever's grip. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through frost-covered windows, a firm knock startled him from his vigil. Mary Johnson stood at the threshold, her medicine bag clutched to her chest, breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I felt something was wrong," the healer explained, moving swiftly to Anna's bedside. Her stern expression softened at the sight of the child's flushed face. "How long has she been like this?" "Since nightfall," John replied, stepping back to give her room. He watched as Mary's experienced hands examined Anna, noting the gentle efficiency that had earned her the village's respect. "Bring me fresh water and kindling," she instructed, already unpacking dried herbs and tinctures. "And that jar of honey you keep hidden behind your flour sack." For hours, they worked together in silent harmony. Mary crushed herbs into poultices, muttering ancient healing words passed down through generations. John followed her instructions without question, setting aside his pride in the face of Anna's need. "Hold her up," Mary directed as she prepared a bitter-smelling tea. "She must drink every drop." The girl whimpered but swallowed the medicine. John cradled her against his chest, feeling each labored breath as if it were his own. Near midday, Anna's fever finally broke. Her eyelids fluttered open, recognition slowly dawning in her gaze. "You stayed," she whispered to John, her voice barely audible. The hermit's weathered face crumpled, tears streaming unchecked down his cheeks. Across from him, Mary's eyes glistened as well, the shared battle forging an unspoken bond between them. "Always," John promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always stay." The melting snow cascaded down the mountainside, carrying winter's remnants toward the valley below. With the first thaw came not only fresh green shoots, but also unexpected revelations that would shake the fragile peace John Smith had cultivated with Anna. Jane Davis arrived with her wagon of traded goods just as the mountain paths cleared. The traveling trader, known for her sharp eye and sharper tongue, froze mid-sentence when Anna approached John's cart at the village square. The woman's weathered face paled as she stared at the child. "Those eyes," Jane whispered, her voice barely audible above the bustle of the spring market. "I've seen their like before, among the Blackwood family in the lowlands. Same unusual shade." Same shape. John felt his chest tighten. He placed a protective hand on Anna's shoulder, but the damage was done. Villagers gathered around, their curiosity piqued by Jane's reaction. The trader continued, describing a powerful family whose youngest daughter had vanished under mysterious circumstances years ago. They still search for her, Jane explained, her gaze never leaving Anna's face. Offer rewards in every town and village. By nightfall, whispers had transformed into accusations. Some villagers suggested John had been hiding the child deliberately, perhaps for ransom. Others wondered if Anna was a pawn in some larger political game between mountain folk and lowlanders. Elder Thomas Davis called for a council meeting, his weathered face grave as he considered the implications of harboring what might be a lost heir. Back in his cabin, John paced before the hearth. Anna sat quietly, weaving dried grasses into patterns Mary Johnson had taught her. She seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around her existence, yet John knew her perceptiveness ran deeper than most realized. "Am I going away?" she asked suddenly, her fingers never pausing in their work. The hermit knelt beside her, his throat tight with emotion. "No one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go," he promised, though uncertainty gnawed at him. Later that night, Mary arrived with a bundle of spring herbs. The healer's expression was troubled as she shared the latest rumors sweeping through the village. "The Blackwoods are powerful people," she warned. "If they learn she's here..." John felt the ground shift beneath him. Everything he'd built, this fragile life, this unexpected family, suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. Was protecting Anna keeping her hidden in these mountains? Or was it helping her reclaim a birthright she'd never known? The question haunted him as he watched her sleep, her face peaceful despite the storm gathering around them. The axe bit deep into the fallen pine as John gathered wood for the coming week. Winter's grip had loosened, but the mountain nights remained bitter. His thoughts drifted to Anna, who was helping Mary Johnson sort dried herbs back at the cabin. The child's health had improved remarkably under the healer's guidance. Venturing deeper into the forest than usual, John spotted an unusual formation among the trees. What he'd initially mistaken for a rock outcropping was actually the collapsed remains of a small hut, its roof partially caved in beneath years of snow and neglect. Something tugged at his memory. His brother had mentioned a hunting shelter in this area years ago. "Michael," John whispered, his brother's name catching in his throat. 5 years had passed since the fever took him, yet the wound felt fresh as John ducked through the sagging doorway. The interior was a time capsule. Rotted blankets, rusted tools, and animal bones littered the earthen floor. As he shifted a fallen beam, something caught his eye, a leather-bound book wedged between stones of the collapsed hearth. The hermit's calloused fingers trembled as he recognized his brother's handwriting on the first page. It was Michael's journal, somehow preserved from the elements. John sank to his knees, brushing pine needles from its cover. He hadn't expected to find anything of his brother here, much less his private thoughts. The fading light forced him to move toward the doorway. As pages turned beneath his rough fingers, certain entries made his blood run cold. Dated 3 years ago, his brother wrote of a pregnant woman from beyond the mountains, seeking refuge from powerful enemies. Michael had helped her, hiding her presence from the village. "I cannot tell John," one entry read. "His isolation protects him from the dangers of knowing." Later pages described a birth, a child, and arrangements made with someone identified only as R. Could it be Robert Brown? The blacksmith had always been close to Michael, despite their differences. The final entry chilled John to the bone. "The mother is gone. The child must be hidden where those who search cannot find her. The river will carry her to safety." John closed the journal, his mind reeling. Anna's arrival was no accident. His own brother had orchestrated it, perhaps intending the child to find her way to John all along, Grief and betrayal warred within him. Why hadn't Michael trusted him with the truth? Tucking the journal inside his coat, John gathered his firewood with renewed purpose. The past had delivered Anna to him through his brother's hand. Now he would honor that final act by uncovering the whole truth, no matter how painful the revelation might be. The final festival of the year blanketed the village in a tapestry of torchlight and shadow. Villagers gathered in the central square, their breath forming clouds in the crisp evening air as they awaited the traditional ceremony. John Smith lingered at the perimeter, his weathered face half hidden beneath his worn cap. He watched Anna with equal parts pride and apprehension as she stood among the other children, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Elder Thomas Davis stepped forward, his stooped frame suddenly commanding as he raised gnarled hands toward the star-filled sky. The crowd fell silent. The old man's voice carried across the gathering with surprising strength as he began reciting the ancient invocations that had marked this celebration for generations. "The mountain has chosen," the elder proclaimed, his finger pointing directly at Anna. "This child carries the spirit of our peaks within her. She was delivered by the waters, as foretold in the oldest stories." John's jaw tightened. These were the very superstitions he had rejected when he abandoned village life years ago. Yet, watching the reverence on the faces around him, he could not dismiss the power these beliefs held over the community. Anna stepped forward when beckoned by Elder Thomas, her small frame suddenly appearing stronger, more confident than the fragile girl John had pulled from the river. The healer, Mary Johnson, nodded encouragingly from across the square, her knowing eyes meeting John's in silent understanding. The blacksmith stood with arms crossed, skepticism etched across his features. Robert Brown had never hidden his distrust of the newcomer, yet even he remained respectfully silent during the ritual. When the ceremonial drums began their rhythmic beating, Anna joined the circle of children in the traditional dance. Her movements flowed with natural grace, as if she had performed these steps her entire life. The villagers whispered among themselves, some pointing in wonder, others making protective gestures against unknown forces. "She dances like she was born to our ways," a woman murmured nearby. John watched, transfixed. The girl who had arrived as a silent, terrified shadow now moved with purpose and belonging. She had somehow become a bridge between worlds, between his solitary existence and the community he had forsaken, between ancient traditions and uncertain futures. For a fleeting moment, Anna's eyes found his across the firelit square. Her smile, radiant and trusting, pulled at something deep within his chest. The hermit stood frozen at the crossroads of choice. To step forward into the light of community and acceptance, or retreat once more into the comfortable shadows of isolation. The mountain man's calloused hands trembled slightly as the music swelled around them, leaving him caught between two worlds, just as surely as the child who had changed everything. The truth emerged like the spring sun after a long winter, sudden, blinding, and impossible to ignore. John Smith stood at the edge of the village square, his brother's journal clutched in his weathered hands as Mary approached with Elder Thomas at her side. "She belongs to both worlds," Mary whispered, her eyes filled with the weight of long-kept secrets. "Your brother wrote it all. Anna is the child of the Mountain Lord's daughter and a man from our village." The revelation struck John like a physical blow. Anna wasn't merely a child abandoned by chance. She was the living bridge between the isolated mountain community and the powerful family that controlled the valleys below. The symbol on the sack wasn't Robert's mark, as he had suspected, but an ancient family crest, deliberately altered to mislead. "The Lowland family has been searching for her," Elder Thomas added, his voice trembling with age and emotion. "They believe she carries the bloodline that can heal the rift between mountain and valley." John watched Anna across the square, laughing as she helped Jane Davis sort through trading goods. The girl who had arrived as nothing more than a shadow now stood tall, her curious eyes taking in everything around her. In those eyes, John could see echoes of the mountain's wildness and the calculated intelligence of those who ruled the lowlands. The choice before him tore at his heart. He could keep her hidden in his cabin, safe from those who might use her as a pawn in ancient feuds. They could continue their simple life of hunting and gathering, bound by the quiet love that had grown between them. It would be easier, safer, or he could help her claim her birthright, a bridge between worlds that had been separated for generations. She could bring prosperity back to the struggling village, perhaps even heal the wounds that had driven John himself into isolation years ago. "What will you do?" Mary asked, her hand gentle on his arm. John's gaze drifted to the mountains that had sheltered him when he couldn't bear the weight of human connection. Then back to Anna, who had somehow found her way through his defenses. "She deserves to know the truth," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "And then we decide together." The hermit who had once fled from responsibility now stood at the center of a choice that would reshape not just his life or Anna's, but the future of the entire mountain community. The tears he had shed by the river months ago had marked only the beginning of their journey. The village square buzzed with hushed conversations as John Smith stood at its center, the weight of expectation heavy on his shoulders. Men and women who had once shunned him now looked to him with uncertain eyes, their community fractured by the mystery that Anna had brought to their doorstep. "Tell us what to believe," one villager called out. "Is she blessed or cursed?" John's throat tightened. For years he had craved invisibility, finding comfort in the solitude of his cabin far from judgmental glances. Now, standing before them, he felt the old wounds reopen, the accusations that had driven him to the mountainside, the whispers that had followed his brother's death. Mary Johnson stood nearby, her weathered hands clasped together in silent support. The healer had become his most unlikely ally, her knowledge of the past both a burden and a blessing. Robert Brown watched from the edge of the crowd, the blacksmith's stance rigid with suspicion, yet something like respect had begun to flicker in his eyes after John's tireless efforts during the winter storms. "I don't have all the answers," John finally said, his voice carrying across the hushed square. "But I know this. Fear has kept us divided long enough." Elder Thomas stepped forward, his staff tapping against the packed earth. "The mountain sends us signs we must heed," he intoned. John looked beyond the elder to where Anna stood with Jane Davis, the trader who had recognized something in the girl's features that connected her to the world beyond their valley. Half the villagers believed Anna was a blessing, the other half a harbinger of change they weren't prepared to face. "I came to these mountains because I couldn't bear to be among you," John admitted, the confession tearing from him like a physical pain. "I built walls around my heart the same way I built walls around my cabin, but Anna taught me that safety isn't found in isolation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The hermit had never spoken so openly before. "We've all been hiding something," he continued, looking pointedly at Robert, whose forge mark matched the symbol on the sack. "Our secrets have poisoned us more than any curse could." The mountains loomed above them, silent witnesses to generations of joy and sorrow. In their shadow, John felt something shift within him, a recognition that the tears he'd shed by the river months ago weren't just for Anna, but for the man he'd become and the community he'd abandoned. "Whatever comes next," John said, his voice steadying, "we face it together, not as hermits, not as separate families, but as one village. That's the only way we and Anna will truly belong." The mountain air carried the scent of rebirth as John Smith guided Anna along the familiar path to the riverbank. 1 year had passed since he'd found her there, a fragile life tucked inside a rough sack among the reeds. The water flowed clearer now, mirroring the cloudless sky above. "This is where everything changed," John said softly, his weathered hand resting gently on Anna's shoulder. The child nodded, her eyes reflecting wisdom beyond her years. Together, they knelt by the water's edge. Anna carefully unfolded the cloth they'd discovered months ago. The finely woven fabric, with patterns no villager recognized. She traced its intricate designs one last time, memorizing the threads that connected her to an unknown past. "Are you sure?" the hermit asked, his voice catching slightly. Anna smiled up at him. "Mary says sometimes we must release things to truly keep them." John thought of the healer's wisdom. Mary Johnson had become more than an ally in their journey. She had become family. Her knowledge of herbs had saved Anna's life during that terrible fever, and her revelations about the past had helped them piece together fragments of truth. The child placed a small stone in the center of the cloth, folding it carefully as John had taught her to wrap precious things. With a deep breath, she released it into the current. They watched in silence as the bundle drifted away, carrying with it the burdens of uncertainty and fear. "Elder Thomas says the river knows where things belong," Anna whispered. John nodded, remembering how the village guardian of legends had eventually embraced Anna as a bridge between old ways and new beginnings. Even Robert Brown, after months of suspicion, had forged a small copper pendant for the child, a gesture of acceptance that had healed more than one rift in the community. As they stood to leave, Anna's hand slipped naturally into his. The simple gesture still amazed him, this trust that had grown between them, steady as the mountain itself. John recalled the tears he'd shed that first morning, how they had broken through years of isolation like spring water through ice. "The festival starts at sundown," he reminded her. "Jane Davis brought fabrics from the lowlands for your new dress." Anna's eyes brightened. "Will you dance this time?" John laughed, a sound that no longer felt foreign in his throat. "Perhaps." Walking back toward the village, he noticed fresh shoots pushing through last season's decay. The path ahead would not be simple. Questions about Anna's true origins remained, and some beyond the mountains might still seek her. But in her small hand, John had found not just a child to protect, but a reason to belong, a legacy forged by sacrifice, love, and the unbreakable bonds of the mountain.